Keep remembering the golden rule of the satanic Jezebel spirit. Subtle manipulation when weak, overt intimidation when strong. The Catholic Church, with the goddess Mary as their figurehead, was now very, very strong and therefore very, very intimidating. Whenever anyone protested against the Church or didn't fall in line with the dictates of the hierarchy, they were relentlessly hounded to death, and it wasn't until 1517 that things finally began to change. Led by Martin Luther and other prominent men like Ulrich Zwingli, a revolt called the Reformation took place. These were men who were sickened by the excesses and corruption of the Catholic Church and who bravely attempted to stand against its might, risking their lives to expose the corruption and deceit and to bring people back to true biblical Christianity. This movement saw millions of people turn away from Roman Catholicism and renouncing the Pope as the spiritual leader of the Church. The invention of the printing press around this time was key, as it meant that cost-effective, rapid mass production of pamphlets and books could be placed in the hands of individuals in their own language. The printing press opened the flow of information that the Catholic Church had tried to keep shut. People could now see for themselves just how much they had been duped by the system. They could now learn independently about God for the first time in 1,000 years. Of course, the Catholic Church did everything in their power to stop these pamphlets getting into the hands of the ordinary man. They tried even harder to stop the Bible itself from being translated into English, or any other language for that matter. Satan knows how powerful the Word of God is. The Reformers eventually achieved the translations, but it came at the price of great persecution and even death for those involved. It's worth looking at how it developed to see just how much Satan opposed it, and to drive home an important principle. As we noted, by 600 AD, the Word of God had been restricted by the Catholic Church to just one language, the Latin Vulgate. The all-powerful Roman Catholic Church refused to allow the Scriptures to be available in any other language, and if anyone was found to be in possession of one, they would be executed. The reason, as we've noted, is very simple. At that time, only priests were educated in Latin. The common citizen was not. If the people couldn't read the Bible for themselves, they were dependent upon the Church to tell them what it said. If the Church controlled the flow of information that reached the average person, they controlled the average person. The Church would have the power to rule without question, the power to deceive, and the power to extort money. Nobody could question their biblical teachings because nobody knew for themselves what the Bible actually said. The Church capitalized on this forced ignorance between 400 and 1400 AD in the era we now call the Dark Ages. The first handwritten English manuscripts of the Bible were produced in the 1380s by John Wycliffe, an Oxford scholar, professor and theologian who was known throughout Europe for his fierce opposition to Rome. With the help of his followers and assistant, they produced dozens of English translations which were translated from the Latin Vulgate, the only source text available to them at that time. The Pope was so infuriated by this that 44 years after Wycliffe had died, he ordered for his bones to be dug up, crushed and scattered into the river. One of Wycliffe's followers was Johann Hus, who also thought that people should be permitted to read the Bible in their own language. He opposed the tyranny of the Roman Church that threatened anyone possessing a non-Latin Bible with execution. Hus was burned at the stake in 1415, with Wycliffe's manuscript Bibles used as kindling for the fire. The last prophetic words of Hus were, "In 100 years God will raise up a man whose calls for reform cannot be suppressed." Almost exactly 100 years later, in 1517, that prophecy came true when Martin Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses of Contention into the church door at Wittenberg. These were a list of 95 issues of heretical theology and crimes of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther went on to be the first person to translate and publish the Bible in the commonly spoken dialect of the German people. Fox's Book of Martyrs records that in that same year, in 1517, 7 people were burned at the stake by the Roman Catholic Church for the crime of teaching their children to say the Lord's Prayer in English rather than Latin. But if the existence of handwritten Bibles was a threat to Rome's power, the invention of the printing press was their worst nightmare. Its inventor, Johann Gutenberg, invented it in the 1450s, and the first book to ever be printed was a Latin Bible, which was printed in Mainz in Germany. Though he had created what many believe is the most important invention in history, Gutenberg was a victim of unscrupulous business associates who took control of his business and left him in poverty. Nevertheless, the invention of the movable type printing press meant that Bibles and books could finally be effectively produced in large quantities in a short period of time. This was essential to the success of the Reformation and the breaking of the stranglehold of Catholic power. In the 1490s, another Oxford professor and the personal physician to King Henry VII and VIII, Thomas Linacre, decided to learn Greek. After reading the Gospels in Greek and comparing it to the Latin Vulgate, he wrote in his diary, "Either this is not the Gospel, or we are not Christians." The Latin had become so corrupt that it no longer represented the Gospel at all. In 1496, John Colet, another Oxford professor and the son of the Mayor of London, started reading the New Testament in Greek and translating it into English for his students at Oxford and later for the public at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The people were so hungry to hear the word of God in a language they could understand that within 6 months there were 20,000 people packed into the church and at least that many outside trying to get in. Fortunately for Colet, he was a powerful man with friends in high places, so he amazingly managed to avoid execution. Inspired by Linacre and Colet, the great scholar Erasmus decided to correct the corrupt Latin Vulgate. In 1516, with the help of printer John Froben, he published a Greek-Latin New Testament. The Latin part was not the corrupt Vulgate, but his own fresh rendering of the text from the more accurate and reliable Greek, which he had managed to put together from half a dozen Old Greek New Testament manuscripts that he had acquired. This milestone was the first non-Latin Vulgate text of the Scripture to be produced in a millennium, and the first ever to come off a printing press. This 1516 Greek-Latin New Testament of Erasmus focused attention on just how corrupt and inaccurate the Latin Vulgate had become, and how important it was to go back to the original Greek and Hebrew languages to maintain accuracy, and to translate them faithfully into the languages of the common people. No sympathy for this illegal activity, however, was to be found from Rome. William Tyndale then became the first man to print the New Testament in the English language. Tyndale was a true scholar and a genius, so fluent in 8 languages that it was said one would think any one of them to be his native tongue. He is frequently referred to as the architect of the English language, even more so than William Shakespeare, as so many of the phrases that Tyndale coined are still in our language today. Throughout the 1520s, Luther had been using the 1516 New Testament of Erasmus to translate the New Testament into German for the first time. William Tyndale wanted to use the same 1516 Erasmus text as a source to translate and print the New Testament in English, and so he showed up on Luther's doorstep in Germany in 1525 to gain access to it, and by the year's end he had completed his translation. Word of what Tyndale was doing spread round England, and the Catholic Church placed a bounty on his head. He was constantly hunted down. God, however, foiled their plans, and in 1526 the Tyndale New Testament became the first printed edition of the Scripture in the English language. Copies of the Tyndale New Testament were burned as soon as the bishop could confiscate them, but copies trickled through and actually ended up in the bedroom of King Henry VIII. The more the king and bishop resisted its distribution, the more fascinated the general public became. The Catholic Church declared it contained thousands of errors, and they burned hundreds of New Testaments confiscated by the clergy, while in fact they burned them because they could find no errors at all. At this time, people risked death by burning if caught in mere possession of Tyndale's forbidden books. Having God's word available to the public in the language of the common man was fast spelling disaster for the Catholic Church. They were losing their control on access to the Scriptures, and therefore their power and income was being threatened. They could not possibly continue to get away with selling indulgences or selling the release of loved ones from a church-manufactured purgatory. They were on the verge of being exposed as frauds and thieves. Salvation through faith, not works or financial donations, would be understood. The need for priests would vanish through the priesthood of all believers. The veneration of saints and Mary would be called into question. The availability of the Scriptures in English was the biggest threat imaginable to the Church. Tyndale's courage inspired others during the 11 years that he was hunted. Books and Bibles flowed into England in bales of cotton and sacks of flour. Ironically, Tyndale's biggest customer was the king's men, who would buy up every copy available to burn them. Tyndale simply used their money to print even more. In the end, Tyndale was caught after being betrayed by a friend. He was incarcerated for 500 days before he was strangled and burned at the stake in 1536. Tyndale's last words were, "O Lord, open the King of England's eyes." This prayer was answered just 3 years later in 1539, when King Henry VIII finally allowed and even funded the printing of an English Bible known as the Great Bible. Two of the men that had been inspired by Tyndale were Miles Coverdale and John Thomas Matthew Rogers. Tyndale had only translated the New Testament, but Coverdale took it upon himself to translate the Old. He teamed it with Tyndale's New Testament, and on October the 4th, 1535, the first complete English Bible came off the press. His associate John Rogers went on to print the second complete English Bible just 2 years later in 1537. It was the first English Bible translated from the original biblical languages of Hebrew and Greek. He printed it under the pseudonym Thomas Matthew, which was in tribute to Tyndale, who himself had used that name while on the run. Even though King Henry VIII legalized the Bible in 1539, it wasn't because he had a religious awakening. Henry had approached the Pope to ask for permission to divorce his wife and marry his mistress instead. When the Pope refused to give him that permission, Henry renounced Catholicism, divorced his wife anyway, and took the church out from under Rome's control. Instead, he made himself the head of the church in England. This new religion, neither Roman Catholic nor truly Protestant, became known as the Anglican Church or the Church of England. King Henry now essentially acted as its Pope. Knowing that allowing the translation of the scriptures into English would rile the Pope, Henry made it his first act to do just that. He funded the first legal English Bible just for spite. The monarchs of England have been the head of the Church of England ever since. The ebb and flow of freedom continued through the 1540s and into the 1550s. After King Henry VIII, King Edward VI took the throne, and after him came Queen Bloody Mary, who was a Catholic possessed in a quest to return England to the Roman Church. Under her reign in 1555, John Thomas Matthew Rogers was burned at the stake. Mary went on to do the same to hundreds of reformers for the crime of being a Protestant. Christians were forced to flee the country during this era known as the Marian exile. They left with little hope of ever being able to return to England again. Many of these refugees ended up at the sympathetic church at Geneva, Switzerland, which became a safe haven for desperate people at this time. Led by Miles Coverdale and John Fox, as well as Thomas Sampson, William Whittington, John Calvin and John Knox, the reformer of the Scottish Church, the Church of Geneva determined to produce a Bible that would educate their families while they continued in exile. The result of their efforts was a new complete Bible printed in 1560, which became known as the Geneva Bible. When Queen Mary's bloody reign ended, the reformers could return to England. The Anglican Church, now under Queen Elizabeth I, reluctantly tolerated the printing and distribution of the Geneva Bibles in England. The marginal notes, which were fiercely against the institutional Church of England, did not, however, rest well with the rulers of the day. By the 1580s, the Roman Catholic Church saw that it had lost the battle to suppress the Word of God. In 1582, the Church of Rome surrendered their fight for Latin only and decided that if the Bible was to be available in English, they would at least have an official Roman Catholic English version. And so, using the corrupt Latin Vulgate as their only source text, they went on to publish an English Bible with all the distortions and corruptions that Erasmus had revealed and warned of 75 years earlier. This is known as the 2h08min version. In 1589, Dr. William Fulke of Cambridge published the Fulke's Refutation, in which he highlighted the distortion of the Roman Church's corrupt version. After Queen Elizabeth I, King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. The Anglican clergy approached the new king in 1604 and announced their desire for a translation to end all translations. What resulted was the combined effort of over 50 scholars who took into consideration the Tyndale New Testament, the Coverdale Bible, the Matthews Bible, the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, and even the Reims New Testament. 7 years later, in 1611, these first King James Bibles came off the printing press, and one was chained to every pulpit in England. A year later, printing began on smaller versions, so that individuals could have a personal copy for themselves. The Anglican Church's King James Bible took decades to overcome the Geneva Bible as the most popular translation in England. It's something of an irony that many Protestant Christian churches today hold so tightly to the King James Bible as the only legitimate English language translation, even though it wasn't strictly a Protestant translation. It was printed to compete with the Geneva Bible by authorities who, throughout most of history, were hostile to Protestants and killed them. Even after England broke from Roman Catholicism in the 1500s, the Church of England continued to persecute Protestants throughout the 1600s. One famous example of this is John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress while in prison for the crime of preaching the gospel. It was persecution of Christians by the Church of England throughout the 1600s that led to many Englishmen fleeing across the Atlantic to start with new religious freedom in America. I highlight the fact that the Church of England is so close to the Catholic system, with the monarch of England replacing the Pope, because in our time we have seen, and I believe will continue to see, an increasing friendliness between the two and a rejoining of the two systems. In 2010, the Pope visited Britain for the first time in 28 years and was given the hospitality of the Church of England for the first time in history. We'll probably see more of that kind of thing in times to come. I also point it out for the sake of my fellow Scots, as this issue is a part of our spiritual heritage. Although England never had a true Reformation and only left Catholicism because of Henry VIII's divorce, Scotland, led by John Knox, did have a true Reformation and were filled with an incredible zeal for God. The Scots believed that there should be no figurehead or human king to rule over the church because their only king was Jesus and he alone was the head of the church. Therefore, when King James VI's son, Charles I, came to Scotland in an attempt to impose his headship and the Anglican system on Scots, they rejected it and instead created a document called the National Covenant. This covenant was between the Scottish people and God, and declared that they would be wholly devoted to him alone. In response to this, Charles tried to invade Scotland twice to impose Anglicanism by force, but was soundly beaten each time. The Scots were determined to retain their religious freedom. The Covenanters often had to meet in secret to avoid persecution during this time, and hundreds were killed, mostly by hanging, although many were shot during raids on prayer meetings. The last of the Covenanter martyrs was James Renwick, who was hanged on the 17th of February 1688 in Grassmarket Square, Edinburgh. His head and hands were then severed and placed over the gates of the city. The Men of Covenant by Reverend Alexander Smellie describes him like this. It was the 17th of February 1688 when James Renwick was martyred. Before the year was out, the Stuarts were in exile and persecutions was closed. He died as the herald of a more gracious day. He was of old Knox's principles, his adversaries said when they noted his unassailable steadfastness. But we may take our farewell of him in words which were written by one who loved him dearly. When I speak of him as a man, none more comely in features, none more prudent, none more heroic in spirit, yet none more meek, more humane than condescending, he learned the truth and counted the cost, and so sealed it with his blood. The King James Bible turned out to be an excellent and accurate translation, and it became the most printed book in the history of the world, and the only book with 1 billion copies in print. In fact, it had no rivals for over 250 years. It had taken the deaths of thousands of reformers to win the spiritual battle, but in the end their efforts were met with triumph, and it would be of benefit for millions of souls in the generations to come. Catholic control of the information flow was broken, and people can now finally read the Bible in their own language. And that's the main reason I wanted to explore the development of the Bible in this level of detail. The story of the struggle highlights the importance of the flow of information in the spiritual war. Notice how hard Satan fought to keep control of it. Knowledge is power. Satan tried to establish a hierarchy of knowledge that would create a dependency on the corrupt Catholic priests. The priests at the top of the pyramid could then control the ignorant masses for their own purposes and keep them in ignorance. Human beings could be reduced to puppets of the hierarchy, taught what to believe and how to behave. This is repeated in all occult systems. A mass of muggles controlled by an informed elite who are controlled very often without even realizing it. You see, controlling people must start with controlling what they believe, because that will dictate their actions. So notice how hard Satan battled to oppose freedom of thought and free speech, to keep control of the channels of information. Notice how he used the Catholic Church to tell people what they should think, and then used ignorance to keep people blinded, deceived, and in chains. Notice how he enforced the situation with fear, intimidation, and violence to eliminate anyone who stepped out of line and who opposed him. You may also notice the same double-pronged approach of manipulation and intimidation creeping back into our society today. As darkness encroaches in our time, our laws are changing to eliminate truly free thought and speech. We now have hate laws, for example, which prohibit Christians from speaking the truth. Stories are mounting of Christians being arrested for making public claims about God in the West. Political correctness aims to put a straitjacket on what we're allowed to say. This is coming in because Satan wants to control the information flow, what people hear and what they see. The primary flow of information in our society and in our time is the media, and if Satan can control that, then he can create a homogenized group of puppets who believe the same things and consequently behave the same way. Howard Zinn, historian and author, says, "If those in charge of our society, politicians, corporate executives, and owners of the press and television can dominate our ideas, they will be secure in their power. They will not need soldiers patrolling the streets. We will control ourselves." We'll get to the media later, but if we dare to think differently from the crowd and unplug ourselves from the system, standing for godly truth, we will then be met with intimidation of one kind or another. It's guaranteed. Plan A will control the masses, but for Christians who have access to the truth and are brave enough to speak against it, Satan will resort to Plan B. Christians should look to the bravery of the reformers who didn't bow to the intimidation and who remained steadfast, willing to give up their lives for the truth. They were willing to risk and lose their lives to fight the information war, to be salt and light. The fear and intimidation didn't work on them, and it shouldn't work on us. We shouldn't be afraid to stand up in public for God for fear of being marginalized or persecuted, or losing our social standing, or being made a scandal of. It is estimated that only 2% of Christians in America now share their faith with others. With statistics like that, it seems we aren't even engaging in the information war. Satan is simply advancing unchallenged, and Christians are increasingly being pushed back into the margins of society. At some point we will be forced to take a stand and say enough is enough, but how strong will Satan's position be by then, and how weak will ours be? The sooner we stand up and speak for Christ in our culture, the better it will be. We have to be willing to challenge the mob with moral courage despite the perceived consequences. We have to be willing to be the Jesus freak in the school or the office and to stop learning how to be cultural chameleons. As the reformers show, if we take a stand, we will win. Wherever the kingdom of heaven is breaking in, the Christians carrying the message will be persecuted and killed, because that's what happens in a spiritual war as well as a physical war. Satan will attack. The reformers were killed, but because of their moral courage they succeeded in their plan to break the Catholic stronghold and to get the word of God into the hands of the people. The Covenanters were killed, but because of their moral courage they succeeded in keeping Scotland free of religious tyranny. Jesus' disciples were mostly all killed, but because of their moral courage the gospel spread like wildfire around the world. We need to rediscover some of that adventurous, courageous, defiant mentality if we are to have any success, because if we endure, the kingdom of God will prevail. History proves it time and time again. The question is, will we be courageous enough to stand up and speak up like our predecessors, or will we shrink back? In Revelation 21:8, the first to be thrown into the lake of fire are the cowardly. So let us be strong and very courageous. Let us begin to regard our comfort and our wealth and even our lives as nothing compared to the work and the glory that lies before us. Walt Disney actually summed up the information war rather succinctly when he said, "Our heritage and ideals, our code and standards, the things we live by and teach our children are preserved or diminished by how freely we exchange ideas and feelings." The last command of our Lord Jesus before he ascended to heaven was the Great Commission to go out into the whole world spreading the gospel, healing the sick and casting out demons. In other words, getting on the front foot to fight the information war with the sword of truth, that is the word of God. In future parts, we're going to look at the media and education system to see how Satan looks to control the flow of information in those fields. We can then think about ways to engage in the information war, knowing one thing, that wherever there is a free exchange of ideas, particularly where those ideas pertain to Jesus, Satan will try to shut it down, either through manipulation or intimidation or both. The importance of this concept can't be overemphasized. He doesn't want the truth getting to anyone, so where he tries to shut down the flow of information, it is our job as Christians to make sure those flows are reopened and kept open. We have to get the gospel out into the public domain, any way we can, and at whatever cost. When the Reformation threatened the power of the Catholic Church and drew millions of people away from its clutches, Satan established a counter-Reformation designed to nullify the threat and reassert its position of dominance. At the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, a commission of cardinals was put together to clean up the Catholic Church and to reassert its position of authority as the only true Church of God. Fundamental to this movement was the establishment of new religious orders. The most famous order to be created at this time, and the one that has gone on to become the largest in the world, was the Society of Jesus, or as they are more commonly known, the Jesuits. They would become one of the most infamous organizations in history. It's important we explore the Jesuits because it gives us deep insight into the mind and tactics of our enemy, but for that same reason I want to preface it with a warning that the next few parts will be dealing with some very twisted and evil themes. The founder of the Jesuits was a man called Don Inigo Lopez, who was born into an extremely wealthy family in the Basque region of Spain in 1491. He later changed his name to Ignatius Loyola. As a young man, Loyola was said by police records to be proud, violent, vindictive, and dangerous. His great life's ambition was to become a powerful military commander, which was going well until one particular battle where a cannonball broke one of his legs and heavily wounded the other. This event effectively ended his military ambitions. He was removed from the field of battle, underwent numerous painful surgical operations, and spent a long time in recovery. During this period, Loyola had a nervous breakdown as he struggled to come to terms with the end of his army career and the end of his life's ambition. In this fragile mental state, as he lay there with little else to occupy his mind, he began reading a number of fanciful religious texts about the works of the Catholic saints. Particularly inspired by the life of St. Francis of Assisi, he set out to emulate his deeds and those of others like him. He began to envision Jesus as a type of great military commander, and thought that although his physical army career was over, he could instead become a kind of general in Jesus' army instead, the goal of which would be to capture the world. Now as a cripple, he made his way across Spain to the mountains of Montserrat, where there was a Benedictine monastery. Within this monastery was a sacred goddess idol called the Black Virgin of Montserrat, which he stood before in vigil for 3 days. There he committed himself and his work to her. By doing so, he committed himself to the demonic goddess Asherah. From here, he decided that he would go to Jerusalem and conquer the Muslim world for Catholicism. His ambitions were halted, however, as Barcelona had the plague, and he was forced to stay in the small town of Manresa for 10 months instead. For those 10 months, he lived in a cave, torturing himself physically and mentally, until he began to have dreams and visions. Through these hallucinations he claimed that the secret doctrine of the Catholic Church was taught to him by a form in the air near him, and this form gave him much consolation because it was exceedingly beautiful. It somehow seemed to have the shape of a serpent and had many things that shone like eyes but were not eyes. He received much delight and consolation from gazing upon this object, but when the object vanished, he became disconsolate. Here we see the telltale signs of a demonic cave revelation, exactly like that which Muhammad experienced. More explicitly than Muhammad's encounter, the being came in the form of a serpent rather than an angel of light. Similar to Muhammad, Loyola found himself prone to depression after contact. After the 10-month period in the cave, Loyola proceeded to Jerusalem, where he approached the Franciscan monks. They told him to go home as they did not want any political trouble. It was upon his return to Spain that he started formal training by studying theology at various universities. At this time he, along with a small band of companions, also started making disciples of others. While Loyola preached, it was noted that some of his female followers became so hysterically zealous that one fell senseless, another sometimes rolled about on the ground, another had been seen in the grip of convulsions or shuddering and sweating in anguish. Clearly demonic activity was at work following his cave experience and commitment to the demonic Ashra idol, and for the rest of his life he was known for having mystic powers. In the coming years he would be thrown into jail twice under the suspicion that he was a member of the Alumbrado, or as we know them, the Illuminati, and we'll discover more about them later. The description of people falling senseless and going into convulsions may remind you of scenes from Christian churches in recent times. To deal with that, I want to refer you to a 3-part series called Kundalini Warning, which I'll provide links for below. Please watch all the way to the end for a balanced opinion. By 1534, Ignatius Loyola had 6 key companions, all of whom he had met at university, and they formed the initial military brotherhood of the Society of Jesus. On the morning of 15th of August, 1534, they met in the crypt of the Church of Our Lady of the Martyrs at Montmartre, and took solemn vows committing themselves to their lifelong work. As a man with an army background, Loyola created his order with the principles and disciplines that he had been used to as a soldier. The leader demanded the unquestioning obedience from his inferiors. Loyola was made the first superior general of the order, and they began the work of opposing the Reformation and re-establishing the dominance of the Catholic Church in Europe and around the world. They made their way to Rome where, in time, their society was accepted by the Pope, who at that time was Paul III. Paul III had seen the need of such a military order to repel the progress that the Protestant Reformation was making, as the Catholic Church seemed powerless by its own means. The Pope invested in them the authority to excommunicate all who would hinder or who do not aid the society, to confer orders, preach and administer the sacraments, to change their general, to absolve heretics as well as imprison the excommunicate, to exercise episcopal functions, to confirm, exercise, dispense, etc., to disguise themselves, to carry movable altars, give plenary indulgences, to live exempt, free from secular powers, taxes, as well as jurisdiction, authority, sentence, and command of any other ordinary delegate, judge, magistrate, from any search. In other words, the Jesuits were given authority from the Catholic Church to operate above the law and to employ any means necessary to do their work. With this remit, in time, the Jesuits became the most prominent and powerful of Catholic weapons against the Reformation. Key to Ignatius Loyola's order were something called the spiritual exercises. These were based on the experiences and secret teachings he had received whilst in the cave at Manresa. He basically made a template of what he had done in the cave to summon the serpent with the secret knowledge, and then passed it on to his followers. These spiritual exercises formed the foundation of his entire movement. All Jesuits would have to go through them in order to bring themselves to the same kind of mind as Loyola had himself after 10 months in the cave. They involved systematic meditation, prayer, contemplation, visualization and illumination, and would lead to a trance-like state of ecstasy. By following these rituals, he and his followers were even seen to levitate off the floor. The spiritual exercises initiation would take 30 days, and initiates were brought through them by a supervisor or director. For the entirety of that period they were told what to think, how to feel, when to groan, what to sigh, what to imagine, and they were to cut off all normal human emotion throughout those experiences. By the end of the 30 days, the initiate was to have his mind broken like that of a horse, so that he was now ready to be utterly obedient in all things. An observer of the Jesuits wrote, "Not only visions were prearranged, but also sights, inhalings, breathing was noted down, the pauses and intervals of silence were written down like a music sheet, which meant that the man, being inspired or not, became a machine who had to sigh, sob, groan, cry, shout, or catch his breath at the exact moment and in the order which experience showed to be the most profitable." Using this method, Loyola needed only 30 days to break someone's will and reasoning. The Jesuit initiates, once brainwashed or programmed by the spiritual exercises and further training, were to become as puppets to their superiors. Their constitution states that the Jesuit must give instant compliance to those above them in the hierarchy, completely sacrificing their own will in the process. They were to be directed under divine providence by their superiors, just as if they were a corpse, which allows itself to be moved and handled in any way. Their constitution justifies this absolute and unquestioning obedience by claiming the general of the Jesuits is in the place of Jesus Christ. Like the Pope, the general has invested in himself spiritual authority for worldly power and control. In more than 500 places in the Jesuit constitution, it is taught that the Jesuits should see Jesus in their general. The blasphemy continues in the constitution, saying, "No constitution, declaration, or any order of living can involve an obligation to commit sin, mortal or venial, unless the superior command it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, or by virtue of holy obedience, which shall be done in those cases or persons wherein it shall be judged to conduce to the particular good of each, or to the general advantage, and instead of the fear of offence, let the love and desire of all perfection succeed, that greater glory of Christ, our Creator and Lord, may follow." That nonsense just means that the Jesuit superiors can command an inferior to commit a sin in the name of Jesus Christ, if they feel the end justifies the means, or if it leads to the greater glory of God in their eyes. Loyola even said, "I will believe that the white that I see is black if the hierarchical church so defines it." The order operated on the basis of complete, blind, mechanical obedience to those who are higher up in the hierarchical structure. The entire organization in turn would be at the disposal of the Pope as an army of the most zealous and dedicated spiritual warriors for the Vatican. They specialized in warfare by stealth and deception to undermine the enemy being true Christians of the Reformation. We gain the fullest understanding of their deceitfully wicked intentions if we read their oath, and so we'll go through that in the next part. But before we leave the spiritual exercises, another warning against deception. Paul wrote to Timothy that towards the end of time, people would begin to abandon the faith and instead follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Here are the words of popular American pastor Tony Campolo in his letter called "Becoming Actualized Christians." I learned about this way of having a born-again experience from reading Catholic mystics, especially the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius, a founder of the Jesuit order, was once a soldier, and it was only when he spent a long time in a hospital bed recovering from a battle wound that his heart and mind focused on God. Like most Catholic mystics, he developed an intense desire to experience a oneness with God. Gradually, he came to feel an intense yearning for the kind of spiritual purity that he believed would enable him to experience the fullness of God's presence within. Tony Campolo goes on to say, "After the Reformation, we Protestants left behind much that was troubling about Roman Catholicism of the 15th century. I am convinced we left too much behind. The methods of praying employed by the likes of Ignatius have become precious to me. With the help of some Catholic saints, my prayer life has deepened." We know that behind the Catholic saints are demons, and we know that the spiritual exercises are satanic. Beware the emergent church movement in particular, which we'll look at later in some depth. Satan is trying to sneak his poison into Christianity, and this is why it's so important we study this stuff, so that we're not led astray through lack of knowledge, and so that we learn to recognize deception and evil even when it comes disguised as an angel of light through the lips of people who claim to be on God's side. We're now going to read the Jesuit oath to gain an insight into exactly how they went about trying to destroy the work of the Reformation. When I warned that we'd be going into some twisted and disturbing stuff, this is one of the things I had in mind. It's an extremely disturbing document, but it's important to go over it, as it doesn't just give us insight into the Jesuits. By proxy, it gives us deep insight into the mind of our demonic enemy as a whole, and the tactics that Satan may still employ today against us. Remember, he has no new tricks. Incidentally, I'll post a copy of this in the notes section of the Fuel Project Facebook page if you want to read it again. My son, you have been taught to act the dissembler. Amongst the Roman Catholics to be a Roman Catholic, and to be a spy even among your own brethren, to believe no man, to trust no man. Among the Reformers to be a Reformer, among the Huguenots to be a Huguenot, among the Calvinists to be a Calvinist, among the Protestants generally to be a Protestant, and obtaining their confidence to seek even to speak from their pulpits, and to denounce with all vehemence in your nature our holy religion and the Pope, and even to descend so low as to become a Jew amongst the Jews, that you might be enabled to gather together all information for the benefit of your order as a faithful soldier of the Pope. You have been taught to insidiously plant the seeds of jealousy and hatred between states that were at peace, and incite them to deeds of blood involving them in war with each other, and to create revolutions and civil wars in communities, provinces and countries that were independent and prosperous, cultivating the arts and the sciences, and enjoying the blessings of peace. To take sides with the combatants, and to act secretly in concert with your brother Jesuit, who might be engaged on the other side, but openly opposed to that which you might be connected, only that the Church might be the gainer in the end, in the conditions fixed in the treaties for peace, and that in the end justifies the means. You have been taught your duties as a spy to gather all statistics, facts and information in your power from every source, to ingratiate yourself into the confidence of the family circle of Protestants and heretics of every class and character, as well as that of the merchant, the banker, the lawyer, amongst the schools and universities, in parliament and legislatures, and in the judiciaries and councils of state, and to be all things to all men for the Pope's sake, whose servants we are unto death. You have received all your instructions heretofore as a novice, a neophyte, and have served as a coadjutor, confessor, and priest, but you have not yet been invested with all that is necessary to command in the army of Loyola in the service of the Pope. You must serve the proper time as the instrument and executioner as directed by your superiors, for none can command here who has not consecrated his labours with the blood of the heretic, for without the shedding of blood no man can be saved. Therefore, to fit yourself for your work and make your own salvation sure, you will, in addition to your former oath of obedience to your order and allegiance to the Pope, repeat after me. I promise that, and declare that I will, when opportunity presents, make and wage relentless war, secretly or openly, against all Protestants and Liberals as I am directed to do, to extirpate and exterminate them from the face of the whole earth, and that I will spare neither age, sex, or condition, and that I will hang, burn, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, rip up the stomachs and wombs of their women, and crush their infants' heads against the walls, in order to annihilate for ever their execrable race. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poisoned cup, the strangulating cord, the steel of the poniard, or the leaden bullet, regardless of the honour, rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons, whatever may be their condition in life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed to do so by any agent of the Pope, or superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith, the Society of Jesus. By reading these words we gain a full appreciation of their shocking tactics, which can be summed up like this. Their intention was to become part of the faith, system, culture, or group that they intended to destroy. Then from within they would sow seeds of hate and division. Their method was to present themselves as one thing on the surface, but to be secretly working away with each other for a very different purpose behind the scenes. They would sometimes pretend to be enemies on opposing sides in public, but behind the scenes they were actually cohorts, working together towards the same goal. This type of attack is sometimes referred to as becoming a fifth column, meaning that the most effective way to attack something is not from the north or the south or the east or the west, but from within. Cicero once said, A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and he carries his banners openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gates freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not traitor, he speaks in the accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their garments, and he appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation, he works secretly and unknown in the night, to undermine the pillars of a city. He infects the body politic, so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to be feared. The fifth column tactic is of course a trademark of Satan. It was the very tactic he used to persuade a third of the angels to fall with him and to become his army of demons. He went around whispering in the ears of anyone who would listen to turn them against God. More recently, ex-witches have spoken of being assigned to local churches by their coven with the aim of being involved in the congregation on the surface, but all the while secretly working against it from within, frustrating its aims and unity. If something is attacked from without, it will put up its defenses and fight back. But if, by using deceit, the attacker can become part of the thing it wishes to destroy and gains the trust of those involved, they can take it down from within. But could we really expect any human being to carry out the acts described in this monstrous Jesuit oath? Well, remember that the spiritual exercises were designed to eliminate all human emotion and to turn the men into machines. And just as demonic influence was so clearly at work in Loyola's cave experience, so they are involved in the spiritual exercises. H. Boehmer in Les Jesuits writes, "We imbue unto him spiritual forces which he would find very difficult to eliminate later. These forces can come up again to the surface, sometimes after years of not even mentioning them, and become so imperative that the will finds itself unable to oppose any obstacle, and has to follow their irresistible impulse." In other words, through the spiritual exercises, the Jesuit initiate becomes possessed and finds themselves compelled to act according to the will of these demonic forces within. Because Jesuit actions are centered on blind obedience to their superiors, they are told that they will never be held accountable for anything they do, not even by God. They are absolved of all personal responsibility as they become mere puppets for those that are higher up in the hierarchy. A professor told a student who was studying under him to become a Catholic priest, "You will never have to give an account to God for actions you do by the order of your legitimate superiors. If they were to deceive you, being themselves deceived, they alone would be responsible for the error you have committed. Your sin would be imputed to you as long as you follow the golden rule that is a base for all Christian philosophy and perfection, humility and obedience." See how deceitful this is. The superiors are basically saying, you'll never have to give an account of your actions to God, don't worry about it. This allows them to perpetrate any act in the belief that they are beyond judgment. If their superior tells them to carry out a murder, they think that if they obey, then God will not hold them accountable and will instead blame the superior. This is one method the hierarchy uses to overcome or bypass the conscience of an individual. When you combine this with the spiritual exercises that have taught them to suppress human emotion and imbued them with demons, you can see how they would become capable of some extreme acts of violence, and anything else for that matter. A second vital principle for Jesuits can be summed up in the phrase, "The end justifies the means." Remember this one, it's very important. Before this maxim, the ideas of absolute right and wrong completely vanish. Conceivably, there is no crime or atrocity that is not allowed as long as it is for the greater glory of God. In fact, the sins that achieve the right result become holy in the eyes of the Jesuit, no matter how disgusting. You can lie, cheat, steal, rape or murder, but if the ends are the right ones in their eyes, then the means are justified. This exact concept also exists in Islam, where lying, deception, murder and other atrocities become acceptable if it furthers the cause of Allah on the earth. A third twisted principle of the Jesuits is probabilism. If a Jesuit has in mind to do something but knows it is very probably illegal, if he can find the merest hint that it may not be, he is allowed to continue with his action. For example, if he consults 100 teachers or doctors about his intended action and 99 say that it would be unlawful, but then one tells him that it may not be, he can act on that 1% probability that it is in fact lawful. In fact, if the Jesuit can imagine any reason in his own mind why his action may not be unlawful, however unlikely, this frees him to do it. It's a form of self-deception, lying to yourself to try to keep the conscience clear. Fourthly, there is the idea of directing the intention. This is the idea that if the person meditates on something holy while they perpetrate something evil, the soul contracts no guilt or stain. Therefore the Jesuit can kill someone or lie or cheat or steal, but as long as he is focusing on something holy at the time in his mind, their soul remains white as snow. Again, such is the depth of deceit within the Jesuit system that they deceive even themselves. Fifthly and finally, there is the doctrine of equivocation or mental reservation. This policy allows the Jesuits to follow a secret policy while stating something completely different to the outside world. This is directly from the mysteries where secret doctrines and purposes were hidden under double meanings and secret symbols that seem quite innocent to the uninitiated. A Jesuit quoted, "It is permitted to use ambiguous terms, leading people to understand them in a different sense from that in which we understand them. A man may swear that he never did something, though he actually did, meaning within himself that he did not do so on such a day, or before he was born, or under any circumstances, while the words he employs may have no such sense as would discover his meaning." He goes on to say, "It is the intention that determines the quality of the action, and one may avoid falsehood if, after saying or denying something aloud, then add something under his breath that, if true, would make his statement the truth." So take this example. A Jesuit murders a man on a Thursday, and the police take him in for questioning and ask him if he murdered the man in question. The Jesuit replies, "I did not murder him," which is obviously a lie because he did, but then under his breath or mentally he adds the words, "on Friday." These inaudible words that he whispered to himself after the initial lie have now made the statement true. By doing this, Jesuits can permit perjury and in their own eyes remain blameless. The Jesuits expanded quickly around Europe. One of the primary ways in which they went about reclaiming some of the ground that had been lost to the Protestant reformers was to establish schools of education in various locations. They went for control of the information flows, imagining, quite rightly, that by controlling education they could control knowledge and therefore control the worldviews and mindsets of coming generations. If you go to the Jesuit Boston College website today, you'll see a part where they admit, "When in 1547 Ignatius was asked to open a school in Sicily for young men who were not Jesuits, he seems to have seen the opportunity as a powerful means of forming the mind and the soul. To bring people to God, he sought to form those who, in their turn, would form or influence many others." These schools that catered for children of all ages soon spread across the world as part of a covert campaign to turn people back to Rome. The key to it was that, unlike other Catholic institutions, the Jesuit schools actively encouraged Protestant children to enroll. This tactic gave them an opportunity to indoctrinate future generations with the rites, ceremonies, and symbols of Rome. They particularly wanted to target the children of rich and influential Protestant families because they knew that what was taught to them would have a trickle-down effect on the rest of society. Like Jezebel herself, the Jezebel spirit goes for the powerful men who will influence others. Jesuits also sent missionaries to far-flung places in the world like China, placing great emphasis on the importance of assimilating themselves into their culture. By educating themselves on the language and religion of these places, they could become teachers of the people and work their way into positions of influence. They were incredibly committed, hard-working, and disciplined in these tasks, pouring out their lives for the furtherance of their cause. Wherever they went, they consistently compromised their own message with the local pagan practices of the area to get a foothold, just like they'd done in Rome itself. When they returned to Europe from these far-flung places, they brought back with them the occult and pagan ideas that they'd picked up there. In Britain, the Jesuits made use of fifth column tactics. They started filtering into the country in the 1560s, and almost immediately they were found preaching from pulpits disguised as Church of England ministers. In 1568, a Jesuit priest posing as a Church of England minister accidentally dropped a secret copy of instructions on how to undermine and destroy the Church of England. After a search of his lodgings, further documents were discovered in his boots, including a license from the Jesuits and a bull from the Pope Pius, which authorized him to preach whatever was necessary to inflame animosities and widen divisions. They saw no better way to demolish churches than to infiltrate it in the guise of a minister who could introduce divisive false doctrines and ceremonies from the pulpit. The Jesuits also plotted to kill Queen Elizabeth I on many occasions so that the country could be returned to Rome. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was one such attempt to sail against Britain and overthrow the Queen, who was seen as heretical and illegitimate by Rome. The Spanish Armada was defeated, but true to the Jesuit oath, that which could not be achieved in the open was pursued in secret. After Elizabeth I died and James I took to the throne, Jesuits attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605, the infamous November the 5th gunpowder plot, led by Guy Fawkes, an event we celebrate in Britain every year. There were also murmurings and suspicions that the Jesuits were responsible for the Great Fire of London in 1666, although there seems to be little hard and fast evidence to support the theory. There was simply a mysterious book written in 1667 by a man claiming to be a Catholic Christian, in which he portrayed the Pope as fanning the flames that ravaged the city. In truth, the Jesuits were largely frustrated in Britain, but they did have more success in Europe. Having established themselves in Italy, Spain, Portugal and Austria, they set their sights on Germany, the birthplace of the Reformation. There they gained influence with the rulers and initiated campaigns of persecution against Christians. In keeping with their oath to stir up division and bloodshed in countries that were previously enjoying peace and prosperity for the sake of the Catholic Church, this persecution of Christians led to much disruption, war and bloodshed around Europe. They reignited the persecution against Protestants in Germany, leading to the 30 Years' War of 1618. Although Protestant Sweden stepped in to stop Germany from being returned to Catholic darkness, it left the country in ruins for a long time afterwards. In the neighbouring Austro-Hungarian Empire, Jesuits were so influential that they virtually controlled the emperor at the time. Having this power, they came pretty close to purging the region of true Christianity. In Poland, which was a major European power in the mid-16th century due to their embracing of the Reformation, Jesuits also became enormously influential. This influence led to a decline in national well-being and disastrous policies towards neighbours that eventually led to their annihilation. Entry into France was slower, but was achieved by the formation of educational institutions. Jesuits were implicated in the assassination of the French King Henry III in 1589 and his successor, Henry IV, in 1610. They believed it was their right to kill any heretical monarch. They took the initials INRI, which biblically represented the Roman inscription above Jesus' head on the cross, meaning Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, and gave it a double hidden meaning which meant it is just to annihilate impious rulers. If you read their oath, you'll know that they paid no respect to rank or position. The French king Louis XIV was more to the Jesuits' liking though. Louis had a Jesuit confessor from childhood whose influence turned him into a fanatical bigot, unleashing terrible persecution against Protestants. Louis also led an immoral life, and the Jesuit confessor made careful use of his secrets to have him trembling at his feet for forgiveness. This was a common tactic by Catholic priests generally, to use the confessional booth to gain access to secrets that could be used for blackmail later. Knowledge is power. By 1685, the situation was severe enough for hundreds of thousands of French citizens to flee for their lives to remote areas, and those that stayed behind faced terrible punishment. This was in fact replicated all across Europe, where true Christians had to flee to communities in remote areas to avoid persecution from Rome. Some of these examples are recorded in Fox's Book of Martyrs. As the Jesuits continued to rise to power and influence in Europe, they also accumulated vast amounts of wealth and property. However, their scandalous greed, their loose morals, their ceaseless political meddling, and their encroaching upon the clergy had stirred up enmity and hatred everywhere they had been, and this would lead to their downfall. Amongst the higher classes in particular, the Jesuits had been brought into complete disrepute. Governments began to realize that this single group were the source of nearly all the disruption in their lands. In fact, so severe was their cancerous activity that the Jesuits had become a threat to the very fabric of society. Nations could stand it no longer, and the Jesuits were systematically driven out from previously friendly Romanist countries during the period of 1760 to 1770. Although the Pope at that time, Clement XIII, still supported the Jesuits, the nations of Europe ramped up the pressure on him to take drastic action. The French government were particularly fierce in their protests against the Jesuits, saying in 1762, "The said institute is inadmissible in any civilized state, as its nature is hostile to all spiritual and temporal authority. It seeks to introduce into the Church and States, under the plausible veil of a religious institute, not an order truly desirous to spread evangelical perfection, but rather a political body working untiringly at usurping all authority by all kinds of indirect, secret, and devious means. The doctrine of Jesuits is perverse, a destroyer of all religious and honest principles, insulting to Christian morals, pernicious to civil society, hostile to the rights of the nation, the royal power, and even the security of the sovereigns and obedience of their subjects, suitable to stir up the greatest disturbances in the states, conceive and maintain the worst kind of corruption in men's hearts." Notice the very distinctive Jezebel or Asherah characteristics of the organization described here. The hostility towards all authority, the attempts to usurp it using manipulation and secret means, the desire to claim all authority for themselves. And remember that this shouldn't surprise us, as Loyola spent 3 days dedicating himself and his order to her in the form of the Black Virgin of Montserrat. With her at the spiritual helm, it of course displayed her characteristics. The pressure on the Pope became too much to ignore, and so eventually he reluctantly called a secret conclave in 1769 to bring into effect the suppression of the Jesuits. Mysteriously, he died the evening before the meeting could be held. It was strongly suspected, of course, that the Jesuits had been the perpetrators of the murder. The next Pope, Clement XIV, tried to reform the Jesuits to no avail, and after further pressure from the monarchs of Europe, he finally abolished them in 1773. A year later, he was dead by poisoning, with the Jesuits again at the top of the suspected list. At that point, the Jesuits were forced to secularize themselves, and on the surface at least, they disappeared from society, except in Russia where they were allowed to continue as normal. The Russians wanted to use their skills to subdue the recently conquered Polish people. In return for their help, the Russians would give the Jesuits refuge. Since it was the Jesuits who were largely responsible for the weakening and destruction of Poland in the first place, the people of Poland have more reason than most to feel animosity towards the order. With the Jesuit order more or less finished as an effective religious weapon, though, Satan needed to change tack in his continued war against Jews and Christians. This change occurred in the Age of the Enlightenment. The Jesuit order, with all their subterfuge, deceit, and wickedness, sickened Europe of what they perceived to be the Christian religion. Just like when Catholics were keeping people locked in ignorance to perpetuate their own lust for power during the Dark Ages, just like when they were launching crusades and inquisitions and imposing torture and death on anyone who didn't conform to their faith, just like when they were amassing wealth at the expense of innocent people using extortion, fear, and intimidation, this had all been conducted under the banner of the Christian cross. When they committed their atrocities, they did so using the name of Jesus Christ. Therefore, when people saw all this, they quite understandably thought they were seeing true Christianity. When they saw the Jesuits, they thought they were seeing a Christian order. When they saw Catholicism, they thought they were seeing true faith. They thought they were seeing the natural outworking of God's religion, and so they turned on that God. This anger towards the wickedness of the Jesuits and Catholicism ignited a movement called the Enlightenment. Today God's reputation is still unfairly tarnished in the same way by the acts of the Catholics and Jesuits. For example, when a Christian condemns Muslim terrorists for blowing up buildings in the name of Allah, it's not uncommon to hear a retort along the lines of, well, Christianity doesn't exactly have a good track record either, does it? What about the Crusades? Or what about the Inquisition? And many Christians are either left without an answer to this, or feel like they have to defend the Crusades or attempt to pass it off as a mere blot in the copybook of Christian history. The fact is that the Crusades were not a Christian endeavour at all, they were a Catholic endeavour, and as I've hopefully shown in the previous section, those are very different things. As I also hope to show, many of the people being tortured and killed by the Catholic Inquisition were in fact true Christians. That's not to say that Christians have always behaved impeccably, but the gods behind Catholicism are Baal, Asherah, and ultimately Lucifer or Satan. As we've seen, the Jesuit order in particular was dedicated to the Asherah goddess, but many Christians still don't understand this, let alone non-Christians, and I hope I've done something to clear that up. When I think of the Jesuits, I tend to think of them as spiritual suicide bombers. Sure, all the people of the nations of Europe turned on them, and sure they were run out of every country in Europe and ruined their reputation, but vitally for Satan, at the exact same time, they also took down God's reputation with them. People turned on the God they thought the Jesuits represented. It was fifth column tactics. The Jesuits pretended to be a part of the thing they wished to destroy. So in the 18th century, for the very first time in world history, in an attempt to escape all the religious turmoil that had dogged the world ever since the Catholic Church had risen to power, people attempted to create a godless society which would be free of the kind of corruption and tyranny they had become accustomed to from that Roman Church. We sometimes think of the Enlightenment as a neutral movement to pursue reason and science, as some kind of natural evolution of mankind, where a light bulb suddenly went off above our heads and we realised God was silly. In reality, it was a reaction to something. It was first and foremost, at its heart, an anti-God movement. Reading the quotes of the intellectual leaders of the time, this becomes apparent. Voltaire said, "You will notice that in all disputes between Christians since the birth of the Church, Rome has always favoured the doctrine which most completely subjugated the human mind and annihilated reason." He also said, "As you know, the Inquisition is an admirable and wholly Christian invention to make the Pope and the monks more powerful and turn a whole kingdom into hypocrites." He also said, "Every sensible man, every honourable man, must hold the Christian sect in horror." H.G. Wells said, "The greatest evil in the world today is the Christian religion. Everywhere in the world there are ignorance and prejudice, but the greatest complex of these, with the most extensive prestige and the most intimate entanglement with traditional institutions, is the Roman Catholic Church. It presents many faces to the world, but everywhere it is systematic in its fight against freedom." You see how they use the words Christian, Rome, and Catholic Church interchangeably. These quotations highlight the fact that the Enlightenment thinkers saw no distinction between Christianity and Catholicism. They were looking primarily at the atrocities of the Catholic Church and deciding that if this was the end result and religion of God, then the answer was to abandon that awful God. Instead, they would turn to knowledge and science for the answers. They would make themselves the centre of all things. Like Adam and Eve, they would turn away from the tree of life and put their hope in the tree of knowledge. Like Adam and Eve, they would not see that they had in fact been deceived by the serpent who had whispered into their ears that God was a wrathful deity of hate, intent on keeping their minds in darkness and ignorance. The early Enlightenment thinkers had a fairly big problem, however, in their attempt to create a godless society. You see, if they took God out of the picture, they had no idea where all this came from and how it all got started. The idea of evolution, which suggested that all things could be explained without any kind of creator at all, did not gain public acceptance until Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species, and this book wasn't published until 1859. Therefore, the Enlightenment thinkers in the 100 years prior to this time, although they perhaps would have liked to abandon the Christian God altogether, if they were being intellectually honest, could not. They still had need of some kind of higher power to explain how the world came to exist in the first place. The world couldn't just pop into existence, something must have caused it. No realistic alternative to God that could be backed up by reason and science was available to them at the time. Therefore, a great many of them tended to settle on a belief system known as deism. What deism exactly means is quite blurry, as there are various nuances, but the basic idea behind it is that there is some kind of creator, but that after he created everything, he basically sat back and let everyone get on with it. The most commonly used illustration to explain deism is that it's like winding up a clock and then letting it run down by itself. We don't interfere with the clock after it's been wound. The natural mechanisms built into the clock see to it that the hands keep moving around the face as they should. The deist God, therefore, is one that doesn't interact with human affairs as such, but can be determined using reason and observation of the natural world alone, the natural mechanisms of it, if you like. Because he doesn't interact with human affairs, deists believe God had given no direct revelations to any human being. Therefore, all holy books are mere human interpretations of a universal truth. They all contain some strands of wisdom and are of some interest, but none could be considered to be the absolute truth, direct from the mouth of God. None could lay claim to being a perfect and direct revelation. Deists believe that all gods of the world were basically the same one by different names, and that one person couldn't say that his God was any higher than another. This idea that people should abandon ideas of absolute truths largely came about because people had become fed up of religious wars. Instead of everyone fighting about who was the right God, the peaceful solution was to say that everyone was right, everyone had a piece of the truth, and therefore God became less well defined and more subjective. He could be whatever you wanted him to be, and you could call him whatever you wanted to call him. Many deists tended to settle on general and impersonal names, such as Providence. This generalized God was involved in all the seemingly diverse religions and observable in nature, but you couldn't know him personally. Deism was a forerunner to pantheism, not just that God is observable in nature, but that God is nature. God is the trees, the stones, the birds, the rivers. Some deists believe that God interacted with people through creation, and pantheists went one step further and said that God is creation. In pantheism, however, God tellingly normally becomes female and is referred to as Mother Nature or Mother Earth. Use of that term can slip out quite easily, but we should try to eliminate it from our speech. There is no Mother Earth or nature or anything. There is a Father God. Sometimes people personalize Mother Nature and call her Gaia, and that's just the goddess again. Deism was also the forerunner to universalism, the idea that everyone will get to heaven through belief in their own gods. Because they thought that all the different names people had for God were referring to the same one, it didn't really matter which one you believed in. Deists, in keeping with the increasing bent towards science, began thinking of God in scientific terms. They began referring to him by the umbrella term, the Grand Architect of the universe. The Grand Architect was thought to have a plan for that universe, but deists believe it would come about through the natural actions of men. Like the wound-up clock, the world is ticking towards its inevitable and natural conclusion. Men would fulfill this plan as they acquired knowledge and evolved towards enlightenment. What people were effectively doing was minimizing God. They couldn't do without him altogether, but they didn't like this idea that he was involved in everyday life. Deism was the middle ground that people required prior to Darwin's theory of evolution. When we get our heads round all this, we understand there was a diabolical genius about the Enlightenment as a counterpunch to the Reformation. A situation had developed where people were intent on rejecting the true God because of the excesses of Catholicism, which had nothing to do with God at all, while simultaneously promoting the amalgamation of all Satan's diverse mystery religions and gods under one heading, in deism. Now it was these so-called enlightened deists, searching for alternative truths about spirituality that would take them away from the Christian God, who began to join Freemason lodges. Freemasonry's history is shrouded in secrecy, but up until a certain point at least, it seemed to have the appearance of being a relatively innocuous organization. But from this point onwards, it became a kind of church of deism, and in time, the purest form of the Babylonian mysteries in existence. Freemasonry began with the skilled stonemasons of medieval England, Scotland, and France. way before the Enlightenment. Their trade secrets made them valuable artisans in the construction of castles, cathedrals, and all the important buildings of the time. As a mobile brotherhood, these skilled workers would move freely from town to town, ready to lend their expertise to any particular building project where they might be required. Secret handshakes and other signals were developed to identify one another as members of the craft, and they established exclusive guilds which no other person was allowed to enter. These guilds, called lodges, were primitive types of trade unions that were mainly for protection and credibility. Secrecy within them was necessary in order to monopolize and control the knowledge of the craft. You see, if everyone knew how to do their job, these skilled workers wouldn't be as highly sought after, and this would have an impact on the amount of work they were given and the kind of fees they could command. So even at this relatively innocent stage, we see them trying to control information flows to retain power. Scottish Masons in particular were known to have developed passwords and secret handshakes by the 17th century, and this kind of thing soon spread throughout all the lodges. This wasn't unique to the stonemasons either. Secrecy was commonplace in all types of medieval guild in those days. It was knowledge of a specific skill or craft that gave people prestige and earning power, so they all tried to protect what they knew. This is the relatively innocent origin of Freemasonry, and the period that is now known as operative Masonry, because it was simply about the literal operations of the building trade. As early as the 14th century, however, we start to see sinister glimpses that these lodges had begun to associate on some level with Nimrod. In the latter half of that century, a series of 115 documents called the Old Charges were composed to outline in a formal way the nature, organization, and functions of the craft. A 1425 manuscript shows that Freemasons had begun to trace their origins back to Nimrod as the instigator of the first great building project in world history, the construction of the Tower of Babel. Because of the tower and the fact that Nimrod was renowned as an architect and builder of many great cities within his empire, they began to revere him even at that stage as the originator or father of their craft. Within modern Masonry, therefore, there is still an oath of Nimrod and a charge of Nimrod that initiates are asked to recite and obey. Now remember how I said that religions take on the characteristics of their prophet? Well, that's a rough idea of what happened here. These old charges began to establish spiritual principles based on the mystery ideas taken from Babylon. Over time, the organization of Freemasonry evolved with an increasing emphasis on these spiritual metaphors and less focused on the actual construction of buildings. By the late 1600s, just as the Enlightenment was getting going, Masonic lodges started enrolling growing numbers of accepted gentlemen who had no direct links to the building trade at all. Some writers suggest that this happened simply because of a growing interest in architecture amongst the nobility. The truth is that there was a growing conviction amongst the populace that these Masonic lodges, with all their secrets and symbolism, were starting to harbour truths handed down from ancient civilizations, and by joining them they may be able to get ahead in the world. By the early 1700s, all the original emphases on the principles of stonemasonry had been turned into allegories with occult spiritual meaning. To take a random example, unhewn stone was said to symbolize man in his infant or primitive state, rough and unpolished. Polished stone was on the other hand representative of man in the decline of years after a regular well-spent life in acts of piety and virtue which cannot otherwise be tried and approved than by the square of God's word and the compass of his own self-convincing conscience. As illustrated here, tools of the trade such as the square and compass were used to describe spiritual and philosophical ideas. When people turned away from God and the Enlightenment, the spiritual vacuum was filled by Freemasonry. Politicians, scientists, even clergymen, the most influential and powerful enlightened movers and shakers of the day, were the new initiates. Freemasonry stopped being about the operative building trade and instead became what's referred to as speculative, because it had nothing to do with the physical building trade anymore and did instead speculate as to the true spiritual meanings behind the original symbols. The interest in Nimrod and Babylon had taken over their whole organization. The new initiates saw themselves not as builders of cathedrals and castles, but builders of a new society that would be free of religious tyranny. It would be based on the so-called enlightened truths handed down from ancient times. The first Grand Lodge of Freemasonry was established in 1717, and this is generally held to be the official beginning of speculative Masonry. Freemasonry at this point effectively became the Church of Deism. It was also from this point that Freemasonry effectively became the truest form of the ancient mysteries in the world, having gathered ancient wisdom from all the mystery religions throughout history. Freemasonry then leads us on to the infamous Illuminati. Any talk of the Illuminati normally begins with a man called Adam Weishaupt. Adam Weishaupt was born on February the 6th, 1748, in Bavaria, Germany. At the age of 7 he enrolled in a Jesuit school, and the occult ideas that were taught to him from that young age stuck with him for the rest of his life, helping to form his worldview and ideologies. As he grew up, he also studied classic religion, which is a euphemism for Gnosticism and other ancient forms of the mysteries. Thus, by the time Weishaupt reached adult maturity, he was very well versed in the occult. When Pope Clement XIV abolished the Jesuits in 1773, Weishaupt went on to become a professor of Catholic canon law, a post that only Jesuits had ever held up until that point, and within a few years he had joined the secret society of Freemasonry. Now, when Adam Weishaupt joined Freemasonry in the 1770s, it had already long been a fully occult society, but it was organized into the telltale pyramid-shaped knowledge hierarchy. The masses or muggles at the lower end of the society were completely ignorant of the true nature and meaning behind their doctrines and rituals. It was only as they rose through the degrees of esoteric knowledge and moved closer to the all-seeing eye of Lucifer at the top that the truth, or so-called light of Freemasonry as they see it, began to illuminate their minds. I use the past tense, but it's the same today. In the Scottish Rite version of Freemasonry, which is the most widely known and practiced, there are a minimum of 33 degrees to ascend through in the hierarchy, with still more elite Illuminati degrees, such as the Shriners above that. Those in the lower degrees simply have no clue that they are part of an organization that ultimately worships Baal, Asherah, and Lucifer. Even those relatively high up are misdirected, and even Christians have been ensnared in the organization believing it is compatible or even complementary to their faith. Weishaupt, however, was no such muggle. With his Jesuit background and knowledge of the mysteries through his studies of classical religion and Greek philosophy, he was well aware of the origin of the doctrines and rituals of speculative Masonry. Therefore, on May 1st, 1776, just 3 years after the Jesuits were formally shut down, he attempted to form his own elite secret society within a secret society. He would base it on the exact same principles and techniques of the Jesuit order. He would try, and largely fail, to recruit ex-Jesuits as initiates, and would call this order the Order of Perfectibilists. In time, they became more famously known as Ordo Illuminati Bavarensis, or the Illuminati for short. The Illuminati means the Enlightened Ones. These were to be an elite group made up of only those at the top of the Freemasons' pyramid. They prided themselves on their intellectual superiority and depth of insight over the average man, whether Freemason or not. Incidentally, Weishaupt's name literally translates as the man to lead those who know. The word Adam means man, the word Weiss means to know, and Haupt means leader. The Illuminati were basically the Jesuits reincarnated under a deist or secular guise. When Weishaupt approached ex-Jesuits to join the order, he baited them with the promise that they would recover the influence which they had formerly possessed. He imbued the Illuminati with the exact same ideas that had pervaded the Jesuit order, those characteristics we associate with Jezebel or Asherah. Like the Jesuits, the aim of the Illuminati was nothing less than complete power and control. Most worryingly of all, they retained the core mantra that would justify any number of atrocities, that the end justifies the means. The end, in the case of the Illuminati, was the complete destruction of all Christianity, the overturn of all monarchies, and the creation of a new world order. The deists, Freemasons, and Illuminists recognized that kings and queens derived their temporal authority from the spiritual authority of the Pope, and that he effectively controlled monarchies from behind the scenes, Just as Nimrod and Semiramis maintained control of their empire through perceived religious authority, monarchs in Europe looked for the same kind of confirmation from popes to maintain control of their own lands. Their rule was not legitimate unless the pope said so. Therefore, in the eyes of the populace, there was this inextricable link between monarchies and the corrupt Catholic religious system, and it was this joining of the church and the state, the temporal and spiritual, that had brought so much oppression and wickedness. The solution for the Illuminati, therefore, was to separate church and state and to destroy both in the process. Christianity would be shut down, and the monarchies who derived their legitimacy from the Pope would have to be overthrown. There would need to be revolution. This is effectively what the Illuminati set out to achieve. Professor John Robinson, a Freemason who claims he was approached by the Illuminati to join the elite order, wrote in his book Proofs of Conspiracy in 1797, "The Illuminati were conceived, organized, and activated by professionals and intellectuals, many of them brilliant but cunning and clever, who decided to put their minds in the service of total evil. A conspiracy conceived not by Masons as Masons, but by evil men using Freemasonry as a vehicle for their own purposes. I have found that the cover of a Masonic lodge has been employed in every country for venting and propagating sentiments in religion and politics that could not have circulated in public without exposing the author to great danger. I found that this impunity has gradually encouraged men of licentious principles to become more bold and to teach doctrines subversive of all our confidence in the moral government of the universe. I have been able to trace these attempts made under the specious pretext of enlightening the world by the torch of philosophy. I have observed these doctrines gradually diffusing and mixing with all the different systems of Freemasonry till at last an association has been formed for the express purpose of rooting out all the religious establishments and overturning all the existing governments of Europe. The primary goal of the Illuminist is to get the possession of riches, power and influence without industry, and to accomplish this they want to abolish Christianity, and then universal profligacy will procure them the adherence of all the wicked and enable them to overturn all the civil governments of Europe, after which they will think of farther conquests and extend their operations to the other quarters of the globe." Just a quick interjection to point out the important statement made that abolishing Christianity would lead to universal profligacy. This is still true today. The spiritual temperature of a city, nation and continent largely depends on the spiritual temperature of the Christian Church. If we find our culture falling into wickedness, it is probably because our churches are failing. While just our mere presence on the earth is slowing the rate of decay and acting as a barrier to Satan, we have been told to be salt and light. How salty we are will preserve morals and standards in our society, and how brightly we shine will determine the kind of place we live in. We need to shake off apathy and fear and learn how to be both salt and light again today. John Robinson then goes further, explaining, "An association has been formed for the express purposes of rooting out all the religious establishments and overturning all existing governments. The leaders would rule the world with uncontrollable power, while all the rest would be employed as tools of the ambition of their unknown superiors." Robinson is describing an occult hierarchy here, a few elite, illuminated ones ruling over a mass of muggles, except this time it's on a global scale. Weishaupt was well aware that Freemasonry was the perfect vehicle for the Illuminati simply because of its secrecy. He says, "The great strength of our order lies in its concealment. Let it never appear in any place in its own name, but always concealed by another name and another occupation. None is fitter than the lower degrees of Freemasonry. The public is accustomed to it, expects little from it, and therefore takes little notice of it. Next to this, the form of a learned or literary society is best suited to our purpose, and had Freemasonry not existed, this cover would have been employed." Freemasonry was chosen because the public already knew about it and thought it harmless. Its origins as a trade union for craftsmen meant the average person thought nothing of it, and this was the perfect cloak of cover. If we look a little more at the principles of the Illuminati, we'll see them as a continuation of the Jesuit order. For example, Adam Weishaupt wrote, "If in order to destroy all Christianity, all religion, we have pretended to have the sole true religion, remember that the end justifies the means. those which we have taken to deliver you, those which we have taken to deliver one day the human race from all religion, are nothing else than a pious fraud which we reserve to unveil one day in the grade of magus, or philosopher illuminated. Once again we see that phrase, the end justifies the means. Everything and anything could be perpetrated by an illuminist as long as the end result was the right one, the advancement of a new type of society. This could, and indeed would, involve even violent revolution and the destruction of property, lives, and society itself. One of the mottos of the Illuminati was, "Order out of chaos." The idea was that they'd introduce chaos in the forms of wars, fighting, and distrust, and then having created it in the first place, step in to offer their own self-serving solutions which people would clamber to accept. Using the fifth column, a network of spies would be integrated into society to do the job. In these respects, there was virtually no difference between the Jesuit order that Weishaupt had come from and his new society. The only real difference was that the Jesuits had claimed to be a religious order, while the Illuminati conducted their efforts in a deistic or secular guise. We see in the Illuminati the trademark thirst for control that suggests Ashura's presence. The Illuminati didn't care whether people agreed to be ruled by them or not. They saw it as their right, as intellectual superiors to the Muggles, to impose upon the world what was best for it. The Illuminati were, and still are, a people who despise legitimate authority and work tirelessly to usurp it. When they are in a position of weakness, they work towards that end through subterfuge, deception, and lies. However, they made no bones of the fact that they fully expected to one day be in a position of power, and when that day came, they would rule tyrannically with intimidation and terror. Their ultimate aim was complete control, and they would go to any lengths to attain it. The whole order works within the trademark hierarchy system as well. Some quotes. The first duty of the reader of this synopsis is to obey the edicts of his Grand Lodge. Right or wrong, his very existence as a Mason hangs upon obedience to the powers immediately set above him. Failure in this must infallibly bring down expulsion, which, as a Masonic death, ends all. The one unpardonable crime in a Mason is contumacy or disobedience. The first duty of every Mason is to obey the mandate of the Master. The order must at once be obeyed. Its character and its consequences may be matters of subsequent inquiry. The Masonic rule of obedience is like the nautical imperative: obey orders even if you break owners. Again, just like the Jesuits, right or wrong is unimportant compared to slavish obedience to the hierarchy. Combined with the end justifies the means, there are no moral barriers left between people and the darkest depths of depravity. Superiors would command inferiors to commit a crime, and then, having done it, superiors could blackmail them by threatening to expose their actions. The Jesuits also used confessional booths to blackmail and control kings and queens in this manner. According to a joint deposition signed by Professor Renner and his 3 colleagues, the object of the first degrees of Illuminism was to train the adepts in the system of espionage. Once the member had so committed himself to such nefarious acts of espionage, treason, or other treacherous enterprises, he remained in a state of perpetual dread, fearing his superiors might at some time reveal the criminal activity. Remember how the Jesuits had various methods of suppressing their conscience and avoiding justice that mainly centered on lying, deception of self and others. This also continues in the Illuminati. You must conceal all the crimes of your brother Masons, except murder and treason, and these only at your own option. And should you be summoned as a witness against a brother Mason, be always sure to shield him. Prevaricate, don't tell the whole truth in his case, keep his secrets, forget the most important points. It may be perjury to do this, it is true, but you're keeping your obligations, and remember, if you live up to your obligations strictly, you'll be free from sin. As for the Ashura or Jezebel trait of intimidation, when a brother reveals any of our great secrets, whenever, for instance, he tells anything about Boaz or Tubal-Cain or Jachin or that awful Mahabone, or even whenever a minister prays in the name of Christ in any of our assemblies, you must always hold yourself in readiness, if called upon, to cut his throat from ear to ear, pull out his tongue by the roots, and bury his body at the bottom of some lake or pond. Of course, all this must be done in secret, as it was in the case of that notorious man Morgan, for both law and civilization are opposed to such barbarous crimes. But then, you know you must live up to your obligation, and so long as you have sworn to do it, by being very strict and obedient in the matter, you'll be free from sin. What I've aimed to do in the last few parts is to show that through Freemasonry, Satan didn't abolish his plans in the Enlightenment. He merely changed tack and perpetuated his mysteries under a deistic or secular guise. The words of Weishaupt explaining the purpose of his order give it away. He said it was for illumination, enlightening the understanding by the sun of reason, which will dispel the clouds of superstition and of prejudice. We haven't seen language like that for a while, but the source of this enlightened understanding is the sun, and we know that the sun represents Baal. So the usual themes are all here: deception, control, total obedience to the hierarchy, and esoteric knowledge from the sun. In order to conceal the true meaning and nature of their society, Freemasons, like all occultists, make frequent use of symbols to communicate hidden ideas in plain sight. Having come this far in our study, we should now be equipped to decode these symbols when we see them, and so that's what we'll look at next. Occultists around the world believe that once a symbol is created, it acquires power of its own, and that the more secret it is, the more power it has. They believe the greatest power of all is created in the symbol if the uninitiated never discovers that it even exists. This reminds us of the Jonathan Livingston Seagull phenomenon that I mentioned previously, where demons seem to assign themselves to positions created by men to be worshipped. So someone can create a symbol with the wicked intention that it should represent something diabolical, and then because of their motives in creating it, the symbol indeed takes on that power which has been imbued into it. It's nothing less than witchcraft. But if secrecy gives strength to the power of the symbols, they need to give them double meanings to help with the concealment. Albert Pike, a 19th century 33-degree Mason, wrote an authoritative and infamous book revealing the secrets of the craft called Morals and Dogma. In it he writes, "Masonry, like all the religions, all the mysteries, Hermeticism and alchemy, conceals its secrets from all except the adepts and sages or the elect, and uses false explanations and misinterpretations of its symbols to mislead those who deserve only to be misled, to conceal the truth, which it calls light, from them, and to draw them away from it." The adepts, sages, or elect refers to those of the 33rd degree or above, the so-called illuminated ones. Morals and Dogma was never intended for the eyes of the lower Masons or the profane non-Masons. The title page of the book asks that anyone in possession of a copy should return it to the lodge upon his withdrawal or death, so that it would never reach a mass audience. Copies have, however, crept out of the lodges, and its contents are available for public consumption. Albert Pike says of the symbols within Freemasonry, "Part of the symbols are displayed there to the initiate, but he is intentionally misled by false interpretations. It is not intended that he shall understand them, but it is intended that he shall imagine he understands them." He then goes on to say, "There must always be a commonplace interpretation for the mass of initiates, of the symbols that are eloquent to the adepts." Here Pike clearly outlines that every occult symbol Freemasons use should have a false public meaning in order to keep the true darker meaning hidden. When non-Masons or even lower-level Freemasons ask about doctrines or rituals, they will be misdirected with the false interpretation so as to keep them from the diabolical truth. It is only as they advance and prove themselves at the lower levels that the truth is gradually revealed to them. Like we have consistently seen, this system of double meanings is the very definition of the occult: dark ideas and meanings concealed in full view through allegory and symbolism. With this in mind, take a look at this picture from the Grand Lodge of North Carolina. You should now be quite adept at interpreting these symbols. There's the sun representing Baal, there's the moon representing Asherah, an all-seeing eye above everything representing Lucifer. The rays coming from the eye signify that Lucifer claims to be the giver of enlightening knowledge. 33-degree Mason Manly P. Hall explains of the all-seeing eye. The all-seeing eye symbolizes God, who is obeyed by the heavens, manifested in the heart, and will reward the righteous. This symbol is famously represented on the US $1 bill and is depicted by an eye in the pyramid. The pyramid is incorporated in the symbol because God is the great architect. Now we know that the eye doesn't represent God at all, but represents Lucifer, and so that's a misdirection. You will also notice that the sun and moon are above columns. This is a new one, but columns in Freemasonry represent gods. Therefore this image in its entirety, which is replicated frequently in the craft, shows a sun god, a moon goddess, and above and behind them all is Lucifer. Columns are also phallic symbols. Albert Mackey, 33° Freemason, writes, "The phallus was an imitation of the male generative organ. It was represented usually by a column, was surrounded by a circle at the base. The circle at the base represents the female vulva, and therefore inserting the upright column into the circle makes it a sexual symbol, and that brings us back to this symbol we looked at earlier." An article in a Masonic bulletin says, "The female principle, symbolized by the moon, assumed the form of a lunette, or crescent, while the male principle, symbolized by the sun, assumed the form of the lingam, and placed himself erect in the center of the lunette, like the mast of a ship." Remember the mast and ship symbol from Catholicism. There are so many ways to express this exact same idea. We saw earlier that the obelisk outside the Vatican made this point and circle symbol from the air, but you will find these obelisks or Asherah poles literally all over the world. The most imposing and important ones are to be found in the major cities or power bases and financial capitals, but wherever you live, you will probably not have to go far to find one close to you. This obelisk is from London, and this one is from Paris, and this one is from New York. And these were all taken directly from Egypt and rebuilt in their new locations in the 19th century. The London and New York obelisks are a pair, while the twin of the Paris obelisk is still in Egypt. You'll find them on every continent, in democracies and autocracies, in nations of all political persuasions. You'll find them in major capitals, in financial centres, and probably near seats of government and power, but also in the furthest flung and most remote areas of a country. You'll find them in your local parks, in your local graveyards. They are all pervasive around the world and are nothing but sexual symbols representing the satanic sun god, Baal. During the summer of 2009, while still researching the series, I visited the Wallace Monument in Stirling, Scotland, and suspected just from its design that a Freemason may have been involved. These suspicions were quickly confirmed. It was in fact designed by a Freemason. Now obviously it could be argued that most towering buildings today are column-shaped, so a level of common sense must be employed. Not every skyscraper was designed to be a hidden symbol. However, you will find that wherever Freemasons have been involved, sexual connotations are no accident. You will also see obelisks very frequently in graveyards. Often they are for deceased Freemasons, but again, this is not always the case. It appears to have just become the fashion for some, and many may have picked them without realizing their origin. Remember the recurring mountain theme from earlier also. Satan likes to claim the high points in his bid to become the Most High. With that knowledge, I looked for the high points in Scotland's capital city, Edinburgh, to see if there was an obelisk present. Sure enough, on Carlton Hill, there is a significant one that gives views over the whole city. Notably, it is within easy view of the Scottish Parliament, the castle, and other traditional strongholds of power. As the King of Tyre wants to control the Prince of Tyre, the human governors and rulers, you will often find this symbolism within range of governmental buildings or financial centres. There is also a theory that these monuments are built along ley lines being geometric lines that run along landscapes, connecting ancient or secret features together. The idea is that they are channels along which energy can flow between points. It might be an interesting experiment if you were to find the high points within your own area and check for obelisks. If there are no obelisks, you may instead find stone circles or other deliberately designed shapes. Alternatively, look for the seats of power, influence, and financial centres, then check for any obelisks or occult symbols that are overlooking those buildings. Perhaps survey the geometry, degrees and angles at which the obelisk stands to those buildings. You may see physical evidence of satanic influence over government leaders in this way. I know for sure that the local high point in my town often has a stone circle made out of rocks, and if you move them and go back later, they'll have been rearranged back into a stone circle again. Have a look and see what you find. This is perhaps the most well-known Masonic symbol, the square and compass. Low-level Masons are told that the G stands for God or geometry, which the great architect used to design the universe, but the real hidden meaning is that it's representative of the sex act, as usual. The letter G stands for generation or generative power. Albert Pike writes in Morals and Dogma that sexual union could be represented by the letter G, the generative principle. This term generative principle is code for the sex act. Pike goes on to explain that the compass therefore is the hermetic symbol of the creative deity, and the square of the productive earth or universe. Therefore the Masons look at the compass as a male element and the square as the female element, which interact to produce the G in the middle. The square and compass is also an adaptation of the most wicked symbol of all, the hexagram. Historian John J. Robinson reveals in his book, Born in Blood, The Lost Secrets of Freemasonry, that the Mason's compass is nothing more than the satanic hexagram with some key pieces removed. As Robinson points out, the Mason began with a fully formed hexagram and then simply removed the horizontal bar from each interlocking triangle. The upper triangle was then stylized into a compass, while the bottom triangle was made into a square. Finally, he placed a G in the middle to represent the generative force of the male and female together. In this next example, we see they put a sun god in the middle instead of the G. The full hexagram is also used in Freemasonry. Masonic author Albert Mackey tells of the sexual connotation of this hexagram. The triangle pointing downward is a female symbol corresponding to the yoni, and the upward pointing triangle is the male, the lingam. When the two triangles are interlaced, it represents the union of the active and passive forces in nature. It represents the male and female elements. The upward-pointing male triangle is represented by light, and the downward-facing female triangle is dark. They interlock again with a sexual connotation. These symbols have many layers, and nothing is there without great thought and attention. The hexagram also represents the number of the beast, which is 666, because it has 6 points, 6 sides, and 6 angles. Notice also the T or Tau within this particular hexagram. T represents Tammuz, the product of the union between the sun god and moon goddess. The little circle on top of the T also turns this symbol into an Ankh cross. The Ankh in occultism is representative of the life-giving power of the sun. It's also worth highlighting that this male and female, light and dark duality concept has survived in the Eastern forms of the Babylonian religion, such as Buddhism. For example, we are probably very familiar with the yin and yang symbol here. In this symbol, the light side of course represents the male aspect and the dark side represents the female aspect. This again is a sexual symbol, and it's very commonly used in the world today. This black and white motif is represented another way in Freemasonry through checked floors. This is a suitable way of hiding its true meaning from the profane. Albert Pike said the black and white pavement symbolizes the good and evil principles of the Egyptian and Persian creed. It is the warfare of Michael and Satan, light and shadow, which is darkness, day and night, freedom and despotism. The all-seeing eye, or Lucifer, is behind both Baal and Asherah, which means he's behind both the light and the dark. Good and evil, or light and dark, coming from the same source, is a satanic concept. This next photo is a great example of the double meaning of symbols. Look at the floor and you'll see the black and white checks, but you'll also notice a pentagram. An upright pentagram denotes man, Adam and Eve, and this is considered to be the light side. Turn the pentagram upside down, however, and it represents the dark horned goat of Satan, Baphomet. Now look at the photo again. From our viewpoint on this side of the camera, we see the pentagram as upright, which denotes a light organization working for the good of man, and this is how Freemasons portray themselves in public. They like to point out the good they do in the community. From the perspective of the Masons on the other side of the camera, however, and from their side of the floor, they see something quite different in that symbol. From their side, looking towards us, the pentagram is inverted, which is depicting Baphomet and the real dark agenda of the organization. What they see is different to what they present to us to see. Occultists of all types will frequently be seen to be very generous in public. They will become involved with charities, donate freely with their time and money, and generally perform acts that will endear themselves to the public. For example, it was widely reported in recent years that Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling was the most generous giver to charity in the whole of Scotland. This invites statements such as, well, if she gives so much to charity, she can't possibly be a bad person. Harry Potter can't be anything to worry about. We have to remember it is always in their best interests to present a light side to the public which draws empathy and trust, but which masks a dark hidden agenda. Freemasons also wear an apron within their lodges, and again we should now easily be able to make sense of the imagery contained on it. But the aprons are in fact double-sided, like this. The light front side is seen openly, but then contrast it with a hidden dark side that is concealed from view. One thing on the surface, another thing in reality. This quote from Masonic author Carl Cloudy sums it all up. Cut through the outer shell and find a meaning. Cut through that meaning and find another. Under it, if you dig deep enough, you may find a third, a fourth. Who shall say how many teachings? In his typically deceptive way, Satan hides meanings within meanings within meanings, so that darkness becomes light and light darkness. His intention is always to lead people away from the truth and towards their destruction. He is a master of deception. Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma cuts to the chase when he exclaims, This idea of seeking the light is an interesting one because it sounds vaguely Christian on the surface. When Masons talk about moving towards the light, however, they're talking about moving towards the so-called illuminating knowledge of Lucifer, which is in fact darkness. You may hear politicians using this light motif from time to time. Alice A. Bailey, one of the most prominent occultists of the 20th century, wrote in her book, The Externalization of the Hierarchy, "The Masonic fraternity is the home of the mysteries and the seat of the initiation. It is a far more occult organization than can be realized, and is intended to be the training school for the coming advanced occultists." She then goes on to say, "Every Masonic lodge is a temple of religion and its teaching instruction in religion. Masonry is the successor to the mysteries." It can't be made any clearer than that. Alice Bailey, incidentally, was one of the most influential New Agers of the 20th century. Indeed, she invented the term New Age, and wrote over 25 books by channeling from a demonic spirit guide. We'll find out more about her later in the United Nations section, but for now we only need to know that she knows what she's talking about when she talks about occult themes. She then goes on to say, "There is no question, therefore, that the work to be done in familiarizing the general public with the nature of the mysteries is of paramount importance at this time. These mysteries will be restored to outer expression through the medium of the Church and the Masonic fraternity. When the Great One comes with his disciples and initiates, we shall have the restoration of the mysteries and their exoteric presentation as a consequence of the first initiation." Henry R. Evans writes, "Into Freemasonry have been poured the irradiations of the mystical schools of antiquity. Particularly is this so in the higher degrees of the order, such as the Scottish Rite, where undeniable traces of Kabbalism, Neoplatonism, Rosicrucianism, and other mystical cults are plainly discernible. I do personally contend that Freemasonry is the direct descendant of the mysteries, but that our ritual makers of the higher degrees have copied the ancient ceremonies of initiation so far as the knowledge of those ceremonies exists." Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, said, Masonic orders have contained the most influential men in many governments, and virtually every occult order has many Masonic roots. Now finally watch this clip of a Freemason admitting on camera that he believes Lucifer is the source of light and that he is helping mankind. In particular, note his confusion.
Lucifer, what is your problem?
Just that, sir.
Okay.
I'm a Christian, sir.
I'm pure and virtuous and wholesome and innocent. How can you say anything about me?
Sir, you need to be born again.
I am born again.
Now, did you just say that you are Lucifer?
I am Lucifer.
Okay, define Lucifer for me.
Pure, virtuous, wholesome, innocent individual that's out to help people.
Lucifer is?
Yeah.
Say that again. Lucifer is a pure, holy...
Virtuous.
Virtuous. Now, is he the Lucifer that God created?
That's the same one.
Oh, man, this is great. I'm going to put this on the internet.
Oh,
Amen.
God bless you,
Amen.
brother.
Because that's exactly what the Shriners and Masons teach, is that Lucifer is light.
No.
And you're
about
confirming
those hospitals?
You know what, sir? Jesus said, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, we did not do these good deeds in your name? And you'll say, away from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you.
Jesus said it?
In Matthew chapter 5.
Mercy.
No.
That's hard to believe.
So you're a Christian and you don't know that? Actually,
no, I really am.
You are.
Because I'm pure and virtuous.
You're pure and virtuous, okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you're perfect without Jesus, right?
No.
Okay, tell me about Jesus. Who is Jesus?
Well, he's my leader.
Is he the Son of God?
Yes, he is.
Is he the only worshipful master?
Yes.
Have you ever been called worshipful master?
No, because I've just been too busy. I've been working.
Working?
Been working to help people.
What
like
kind
you.
of work? Okay.
Get out of here.
See, this is what a Mason confesses, is that Lucifer is light. You heard it?
So we've learned about the nature of the Freemasons and Illuminati, and we've learned about their aim to destroy Christianity and monarchies. The question then is, what did they want to replace them with? What kind of society were these enlightened individuals after? What would the new system look like in the secular New World Order they were trying to create? The answer to these questions are found in the writings of the classical Greek philosopher Plato. Plato's beliefs in turn were based on the mysteries as handed down through the Persians and his predecessor Pythagoras. Plato's most famous book is in fact called The Republic, and in this and his other works he has much to say on how a society should be run. The so-called illuminated ones took much inspiration from it for their vision of a new world order. So here are some key ideas from that book. Firstly, Plato believed that society should be divided into a hierarchy of 3 levels: the ruling elite, the auxiliaries, and the workers. It's more like a 2-tier system really, as there is no middle class as such. The middle tier just exists to impose the will of the upper tier on the lower. Plato believed that the average individual was incapable of running his own life, and that they should therefore submit unquestioningly to the ruling elite who, because of their superior and enlightened knowledge, would direct their lives for the greater good. He wrote, "And even in the smallest manner, one should stand under leadership. For example, he should get up or move or wash or take his meals only if he has been told to do so. In a word, he should teach his soul by long habit never to dream of acting independently. There will be no end to the trouble of states or of humanity itself till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus comes into the same hands." What Plato was effectively describing here was a totalitarian state, a socialistic dictatorship. Plato believed that average men were nothing more than labouring beasts of the field, fit for nothing else but slavery. He believed that not all men were equal, and that only a small number of elites at the top of the hierarchy were fit to rule. Sound familiar? Those elites were those who were philosophers, i.e., those with the greatest capacity for knowledge. To Plato, it was knowledge that made one man higher than another. Again, I need to emphasize that the middle class is effectively abolished in the system. There's a small top tier that rules and a large bottom tier that is subservient, and then simply a group in the middle to implement it, like the army or police. Look at the economics of the world today and you will notice the middle class gradually being squeezed with higher taxes and greater debt burdens. The elite bankers caused a global financial crisis but were bailed out, and within a couple of years they were operating like nothing had happened, paying out just as large bonuses as ever. The middle class, meanwhile, are left with the tab by way of huge tax increases. During the financial crisis, you will notice that the very wealthy did not have to adjust their lifestyles at all. The gap between rich and poor widened. I won't go into that any further right now, but it is likely that the middle class will eventually be eradicated if they have their way. Plato also says, "We must look for the right kind of rule in one or two or very few men, whenever such right rule occurs. And these men, whether they rule over willing or unwilling subjects, with or without written laws, and whether they are rich or poor, must exercise their rule in accordance with some art or science. And whether they purge the state for its good by killing or banishing some of the citizens, or make it smaller by sending out colonies somewhere, as bees swarm from the hive, or bring in citizens from elsewhere to make it larger, so long as they act in accordance with science and justice, and preserve and benefit it by making it better than it was, so far as is possible, that must at that time and by such characteristics be declared to be the only right form of government." So chillingly here, Plato believed that those at the top of the hierarchy could manipulate, kill and control human beings as they wished, as long as it was for the greater good. Remember the satanic mantra that the end justifies the means. He states that it doesn't matter whether the masses are willing or unwilling to be ruled, and that they may be justly killed or banished in order to control populations. In Plato's eyes, the individual exists merely for the benefit of the state. They have no intrinsic value of their own. He also suggests that a tyrant is necessary to protect people from themselves. Here is a key statement. Philosopher kings must take the city and the characters of men as they might a tablet, and first wipe it clean. No easy task. But at any rate you know that this would be the first point of difference from ordinary reformers, that they would refuse to take in hand either individual or state, or to legislate before they either received a clean slate or themselves made it clean. In other words, in order for this new world order of things to be introduced, the former way of things must first be wiped out. They must start with a clean slate. One way of wiping out the old is a kind of brainwashing through propaganda, dominating flows of information. He writes, "Rhetoric is a producer of persuasion for belief, not for instruction in the matter of right and wrong. And so the rhetorician's business is not to instruct a law court or a public meeting in matters of right and wrong, but only to make them believe." So the idea is not to tell people what is truly right and wrong, but only to make them believe what it is you want them to believe in order that they might be best manipulated for your own specific end. This is morally acceptable as long as the end justifies the means. This is compounded when he says, "The profession of those who are greatest in wisdom, who are called orators and lawyers, for they persuade men by the art which they possess, not teaching them, but making them have whatever opinion they like." Plato praises those who have such smooth words of persuasion that they can make people conform their opinions to anything they wish. A barrier to wiping the slate clean, however, is parents who hold to the old value system. Therefore Plato suggests, all inhabitants above the age of 10 they will send out into the fields, and they will take over the children, remove them from the manners and habits of their parents, and bring them up in their own customs and laws, which will be such as we have described. This is the speediest and easiest way in which such a city and constitution as we have portrayed could be established and prosper, and bring most benefit to the people among whom it arises. So here Plato suggests that children should be taken away from their parents and raised by the state who know better, and who will instruct them in the ways required to bring about change. Not the truth about right and wrong, simply the ideas that will manipulate their minds into believing what they want them to believe. Also, like the Jesuits, who were ordered in military style, Plato believed that society should have a similar kind of structure. Notice how closely this passage mirrors the Jesuit philosophy. Military organization is the subject of much consultation and of many appropriate laws. The main principle is this, that nobody, male or female, should ever be left without control, nor should anyone, whether at work or play, grow habituated in mind to acting alone and on his own initiative, but he should live always, both in war and peace, with his eyes fixed constantly on his commander and following his lead, and he should be guided by him even in the smallest details of his actions. For example, to stand at the word of command, and to march, and to exercise, to wash and eat, to wake up at night for sentry duty and dispatch carrying, and in moments of danger to wait for the commander's signal before either pursuing or retreating before an enemy. And in a word, he must instruct his soul by habituation to avoid all thought or idea of doing anything at all apart from the rest of his company, so that the life of all shall be lived en masse and in common. For there is not, nor ever will be, any rule superior to this, or better and more effective in ensuring safety and victory in war. This task of ruling and being ruled by others must be practiced in peace from earliest childhood, but anarchy must be utterly removed from the lives of all mankind. The words of that quotation could easily have come from Ignatius Loyola. Notice that the individual is so heavily de-emphasized, and that it is all about the collective. Plato also believed that because all humans were not equal, there should be a breeding program of the finest, designed to improve the qualities of the human species. Only the best were to procreate. Those humans who it was believed had undesirable traits should not. This is called eugenics. You have in your house hunting dogs and a number of pedigreed cocks. Do not some prove better than the rest? Do you then breed from all indiscriminately, or are you careful to breed from the best? And again, do you breed from the youngest or the oldest, or, so far as may be, from those in their prime? And if they are not thus bred, you expect, do you not, that your birds and hounds will greatly degenerate? And what of horses and other animals? Is it otherwise with them? How imperative then is our need of the highest skill in our rulers, if the principle holds also for mankind? The best men must cohabit with the best women in as many cases as possible, and the worst with the worst in the fewest, and that the offspring of the one must be reared and that of the other not, if the flock is to be as perfect as possible. And the way in which all this is brought to pass must be unknown to any but the rulers, if again the herd of guardians is to be as free as possible from dissension. He went even further, suggesting that the offspring of inferior humans should be disposed of like a piece of trash. The offspring of the inferior, and any of those of the other sort who are born defective, they will properly dispose of in secret, so that no one will know what has become of them. That is the condition of preserving the purity of the guardian's breed. Eugenics is what Adolf Hitler was doing when he tried to establish a master race of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan humans. This process involved trying to eradicate those who he saw as inferior, specifically the Jews. Plato elaborates, saying, "The bride and bridegroom must set their minds to produce for the state children of the greatest possible goodness and beauty." So they are to procreate for just 10 years, at the end of which they are considered too old to produce any more, and are forcibly divorced. If the couple don't agree to do this, then Plato suggests that wardens, partly by threat and partly by admonition, stop them. If the man refuses in the face of these threats, he is to be disqualified from attending his children's birthday parties and any weddings. If he does appear at these events, then people are entitled to punish him with blows, and the same was to apply to women. Plato also believed that marriage and the family unit should be completely abolished, saying, "All these women shall be wives in common to all the men, and not one of them shall live privately with any man. The children too should be held in common, so that no parent shall know which is his own offspring, and no child shall know his parent."